Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see y'all here today. Got a nice spring day outside, so I'm glad y'all decided to take a few minutes out of your Sunday and come join us here at the Historical Society. Got a really special presentation today. It is on the military and political career of Governor General James L. Kemper. And our presenter is Mr. Harold Woodward Jr. He's also the author of a biography on the Governor General, and he's going to give us, I'm sure, a very exciting and information-packed presentation. So I'm going to ask him to come up, and if y'all will hold your questions until the end, there'll be an ample opportunity to ask your questions and get those answered. Okay? So come on up, Harold.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Well, good afternoon. It's good to see so many people out on such a pretty day. It's hard to believe this many folks would want to come listen to a fellow with a bad leg speak about a man that's been dead for 130 years on such a pretty spring afternoon. But I appreciate you coming out, and I appreciate the invitation and y'all's hospitality. My wife Susan and I were talking. It's been 14 years since y'all had me here, and I'm glad to be back. And I see a lot of familiar faces, and I see some new ones. And it's always good to be asked to come and speak to historical societies, and particularly these close to home that have a special place in my heart, because Orange County has a very special place in my family's history. Y'all don't have to worry about me putting you to sleep. I got a bad leg, so I ain't gonna be able to stand but so long. And I'm not an expert. I'm glad Ray didn't say nothing about me being an expert, because my good friend Steve Huffman said an expert was a man at least 100 miles from home in a suit and tie carrying a briefcase. Well, I didn't put on a suit and tie. I don't have a briefcase, and I'm only about 10 miles from home, so you don't have to worry about me being an expert. About as much about General Kemper as I do. Unfortunately, for many, many years, he was pretty much unknown. And as a matter of fact, my book, when I decided to write a biography of him, the book was titled Virginia's Forgotten Son. And then I got a nationwide publisher, and they wanted to change the title, and it became the Confederacy's Forgotten Son, because it had a wider appeal. They figured people in other states wouldn't buy it if it had Virginia in the title. So, but he was forgotten for so many years. It seems like when we restored the Kemper Mansion there in Madison, even some people in the town of Madison had no idea who he was or that he'd even lived there. And that was a sad state of affairs, but it can be easily explained. He outlived his fame. He lived to be an old man, and most of his contemporaries had already passed on. And, people like General Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, his good friend and classmate, A.P. Hill, they all preceded him in death, and he lived to be an old man in retirement. And the public's opinion and attention had been drawn to other things by the time he passed. As a matter of fact, he didn't get a tombstone until about 30-some years after he was buried, when the United Confederate Veterans held their national reunion here in Orange that year, sometime in the 1930s, and they went out there and put that beautiful stone on his grave. He was born June 11th, 1823, at his father's plantation there in Madison County, Mountain Prospect. It's in the very northern part of Madison County. As a matter of fact, you can almost stand on the veranda and spit over into Culpeper. It's that close to the county line. His father had bought the place, about 600 acres, so it was a pretty good sized farm. His father was a descendant of the 1714 Germano settlement. And his grandfather had settled up in Fauquier County. And his father moved to the little community of Madison when it was announced that they were going to create a county there. And he felt like he ought to be the first man to run a general store in the county seat of this new county. So he moved to Madison, opened what was probably, at least as far as I can tell, the first general store in the town of Madison, and made enough money where as soon as he got tired of running a general store, he had enough money to buy 600 acres and go into farming. That's what he wanted to do. And that's where his son, James, was born, or Little Jimmy, as they called him. He was born into a family that it was 7 children. He was somewhere in the middle, 4 or 5 out of the 7. So he had some older brothers. His oldest brother, Frederick, left home and moved to Missouri and started the Kemper Military School when little Jimmy was just a youngster. In addition to the children, his siblings, his father owned at various times about 18 slaves, 18, 19 slaves. And so there were a lot of children of the people that worked there to play with. And so he grew up to be a happy, young, well-adjusted youngster, but there was no schools at that time. Public schools were still a ways off. As a matter of fact, so far off, he was in his term as governor before public school system was created in Virginia. So his father valued an education and built what was called an old field school, just a little one-room log cabin there on the farm to educate his children and the neighbors' children. They'd hire a teacher for a year at a time, and that was his first taste of education. And then when he was 13, he went to Locustdale Academy up in Locustdale. You would never know it was there today. The school was burned, but the gate posts are still there. If you know what to look for, you can see where the entrance was, ran off of 15 on to 634 going toward Madison. You see some fancy gate posts that look out of place. That was the entrance to Locustdale Academy. It was a boys' military school. And Kemper went there from the age of 13 to 18. And one of his classmates was Ambrose Powell Hill from neighboring Culpeper County. They became lifelong friends. When Kemper graduated from Locustdale Academy, one of the colleges that would accept graduates of Locustdale Academy was Washington College down in Lexington. Now, I didn't know this when I was writing the book because he had attended classes at VMI while a student at Washington. So I went down there while I was researching the book, and I didn't know the schools had become such rivals. When I asked if VMI students and Washington students could attend, they looked at me like I was crazy. But back in those days, VMI was the new school on the block, and it was a state-funded school where Washington College was a Presbyterian school. And so in order to justify spending state money on a military academy, they offered classes free of charge to Washington College students. Of course, they were right across the lawn, didn't have to travel far, to boost the numbers so that the taxpayers wouldn't feel so bad about spending all that money on just a handful of students. Kemper made a lot of friends at Washington College and VMI. 2 of them would go on to become Confederate generals. John D. Imboden from over in Stanton and John Eccles from Lynchburg. These 2 men became lifelong friends with him, worked with him not only in the Confederate Army, but also when he was governor. The old saying, choose your friends wisely, was important because these 2 men and Kemper, the 3 of them, got along famously all throughout life, and they had the same goal, and that was whatever was best for Virginia and Virginians. When Kemper graduated from Washington College, he gave the valedictory address, and make a guess what the address was. the need for a public education system in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Of course, he had to go on to become a member of the House of Delegates, Speaker of the House, Confederate General, and then governor before it ever became a reality. But once he got something in his head, I believe he stuck with it. He didn't forget about it. And we have that man and his idea to thank today for the great public education system we have here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. When he left Washington College, he wanted to study for the law. Him and both of his friends, Eccles and M. Bowden, all three of them decided they wanted to become lawyers. Eccles ended up going to Harvard and got a formal education. M. Bowden and Kemper came from more modest means, and they had to read the law. They couldn't afford, their parents couldn't afford to send them to law school. Kemper went to Charleston, which was now, of course, is the capital of the neighboring state of West Virginia. Back then, it was just a city in the state of Virginia. And he studied law under a man named Justice George Sumners. Justice Sumners was a very respected jurist, had been a U.S. Senator, had been a member of the Virginia Supreme Court. And Kemper, in 2 years' time, was sufficiently read in the law that he stood for the bar and was accepted by the Bar Association as a lawyer. His intention was to move back to the town of Madison and become a little courthouse town lawyer. National politics got in the way of that. President James K. Polk declared war against Mexico. About the time Kemper was on the stagecoach heading from Charleston back to Madison. I don't even know that he stopped long enough in Madison to say hello to his mom and daddy before he went on to D.C. And I tried doing that today. He walked down to the White House, knocked on the door, and got an audience with the president. Right out of college. He must have had quite a personality, or a good talker, or a combination thereof, I don't know, because he came out of the White House with a commission as a captain in the U.S. Army. He skipped over first and second lieutenant and went straight to captain. And he was assigned to the 1st Virginia Regiment as a quartermaster and sent to Fort Monroe. That's where the 1st Virginia Regiment was getting ready for deployment to Mexico. While he was at Fort Monroe, he roomed with another captain who had graduated from West Point and had been in the Army for quite a while. They became friends. Their friendship wasn't quite as close and cordial as with M. Bowden and Eccles and Hill, but they still remained friendly. They had their falling outs, but they always made up. That was Jubal Early, another Virginian, another Confederate general. They roomed together at Fort Monroe. When the 1st Virginia Regiment deployed to Mexico, they were part of Zachary Taylor's army, another man from here in Orange County. And they missed a lot of the fighting. They saw some skirmishes and this and that and one thing and another, but by the time the 1st Virginia Regiment got to Mexico, the majority of the battles had been fought. And it was mopping up that kind of operation. And then, of course, occupying the country until a peace agreement could be worked out. And Kemper he kept a diary. He wrote a diary while he was in Mexico, and it tells all about the Mexican people, the Mexican women he was very fond of, the Mexican food he was even fonder of, music, the culture, and what he had learned as a quartermaster. Like Frank Walker says, you got to keep them dry, clothed, and fed. And he was good at that. He was good at that. And it would pay off later on in his career as a soldier. One of the things that he got the biggest kick out of was he was rooming in a tent with the commanding general, Zachary Taylor. General Taylor wanted to keep his quartermaster close at hand because the army moves on its stomach, as Napoleon was fond of saying. And Taylor knew this, and he knew if the quartermaster was there, he could get things done. And obviously one night, Taylor woke up in the middle of the night screaming, jumped up and ran out of the tent, nothing but his long johns, afraid he had been bit by a tarantula. Of course, Kemper lit a lamp and went looking for this tarantula, and all he could find was a cactus the general had rolled over onto and had pricked it. When he got home from Mexico, got an honorable discharge from the U.S. Army, he set about to do what he had intended and become a courthouse lawyer in the town of Madison. He hung out his shingle, and in no time at all, he was writing wills and deeds and doing things that courthouse lawyers do. He traveled widely. His papers at the University of Virginia from that time, his papers are scattered here and there and everywhere. If you go to Virginia Historical Society, they have his governor's papers. The Virginia Historical Society has a lot of his governor's papers and wartime papers. University of Virginia has most of his other papers. Doing research on him 30-some years ago when I wrote the book wasn't as easy as it would be today. If you knew what you was doing today, you could probably go on a computer and look it up in a matter of minutes. It took me days and days of traveling here and traveling there and digging through this and digging through that. But he was quite well known in Standardsville, Orange, and Madison. Those three courthouse towns seemed to be the kind of circuit that he made. He didn't handle a lot of criminal trials, and that speaks highly of the people of Orange, Greene, and Madison, because there wasn't a lot of criminal trials going on. Most of it was civil stuff, writing deeds and wills and handling probate and one thing or another. I think Kemper soon got tired of being a courthouse lawyer, because at the age of 30, in 1853, he ran for the House of Delegates. He ran against the incumbent, Shelton Leake, who lived there in Madison. They didn't seem to be enemies. It's just that Kemper wanted the job worse than Mr. Leake, I think. And an interesting thing happened. Of course, something interesting always happens on election year. Kemper was representing two nephews in a lawsuit against their uncle. Their uncle had custody of them, and they wanted to be set free from his oversight. And anyway, during the course of the lawsuit, Kemper refused to ask the question that was posed by one of the defendants about whose overcoat do you have on, of one of the witnesses, to show that the witness was under the undue influence of the man that the lawsuit was against. Kemper refused to ask the question in the courtroom. But the very fact that people were talking about it led to Dr. George Nathaniel Thrift taking offense at the fact that Kemper would even consider such a thing. One thing led to another, and a duel was challenged. They were to meet on the banks of White Oak Run at dawn the next morning with pistols. The judge heard about it and issued bench warrants for the two men, and the sheriff had to go out and arrest them. One of them was the most well-known physician in the town of Madison. The other one was a young upstart running for the House of Delegates. They posted a $100 bond. The duel never took place, but it was an interesting story, so interesting that there was a book written about it. Whose overcoat do you have on? I don't think it did Kemper a bit of harm, because he won by a landslide and got sent off to Richmond. And unlike a lot of freshman legislators, he wasn't a bit bashful. First day or two in Richmond, he gave a 3-hour speech from the floor of the House of the Delegates. And the subject of the speech, anybody drive on 15 coming in here today from north? The subject was the importance of building a road to connect Orange and Culpeper. And you could probably said what he said in 15 minutes. He said it took him 3 hours, but the state funded that turnpike and built the road. He was a member of the Military Affairs Committee of the General Assembly. And now if you look at this period of time in the 1850s, the conditions between North and South was worsening. Arguments over admitting states either as free states or slave states. Of course, there's a big mess out in Kansas and Missouri with the ruffians and the redlegs, and it was just John Brown and all that. So the national attention was on this. And Kemper, as chairman, he eventually became chairman of the Military Affairs Committee. His goal was to see Virginia have an armed neutrality. Not take sides with North or South, but be armed in case they needed to be, to defend the state of Virginia. And he was so good at it, on the field of battle at the Battle of First Manassas, 21 of the 23 guns, cannon that were employed by the Confederate Army that day belonged to the state of Virginia and had been bought while Kemper was chairman of that committee. He ran for re-election 4 more times to the House of Delegates and never had a challenger. Ran unopposed for the next 4 times. In 1863, he was made Speaker of the House of Delegates and served a term as Speaker of the House. He has an unblemished record in the House of Delegates. If you look at him, he worked tirelessly for his constituency, Madison County, but also for the state of Virginia. Used good common sense. Probably suffered a little bit in his law practice because he wasn't in Madison practicing law when he should have been. 1853, he was 30 when he went to Richmond. That was an important year for him because that was also the year he got married. He married Cremora Conway Cave. Belle was her nickname, Belle Cave. She was 16 and he was 30. Her daddy was the clerk of the court in Madison. Kemper fell head over heels in love with her, and they got married. Family. He didn't have enough money to buy a home, so they lived with his mother-in-law for a while, and that didn't work out too good. So Kemper got a piece of land as a settlement in a lawsuit, as payment for a lawsuit where he represented the client in, and the piece of property had a log home on it. He added a little brick wing onto it. The reason was that there was a brickyard there, and he had thousands and thousands of free brick. So, but it was a comfortable little place. He raised a family there. Had him and his wife. They were close to the courthouse. They were close to the seat of the county government, and everything was going good until John Brown's raid in 1859. And when John Brown raided Harpersburg in Commonwealth, Virginia, it created a situation, a dire situation, an emergency. And Kemper was required in Richmond. He was at that time he was a brigadier general in the state militia, and the most of his duties had been attending the annual muster and filling out some paperwork and things like that. But now Virginia was taking on a wartime footing. Virginia had been invaded. And when Virginia voted to secede in April of 1861, Kemper cast his vote for secession. He was a secessionist. He had argued for armed neutrality, but when President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers from the Commonwealth of Virginia to fight sister southern states, that was a line that couldn't be crossed. He was still a member of the General Assembly, but he was commissioned a colonel in the Confederate Army at that time, given command of the 7th Virginia Regiment of Infantry. Men from Madison, Orange, Culpeper, Rappahannock, and one company from way down in Giles County. I mention that because my mother was from Giles County, and she met my daddy when she was a nurse in Charlottesville. And my daddy's great-granddaddy and her great-granddaddy served together in the War between the States. At the first Battle of Manassas, Kemper was fully ready to lead his troops, but General Beauregard had different plans. Beauregard remembered him from his Mexico days when he was a quartermaster for General Taylor. And one thing the Confederate Army needed at Manassas, worse than it needed a colonel leading an infantry regiment, was a good quartermaster. And so Kemper was detailed from his regiment to be General Beauregard's quartermaster at First Manassas. After the Battle of Manassas, Kemper rejoined his regiment. And when he wasn't required to be in Richmond dealing with political matters at the General Assembly, he was with his 7th Virginia. Had an excellent record as a commander. So good that when General Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia, it was right after one of the 7 Days battles where Kemper had really outstood himself in combat. He had led a charge against a Yankee artillery placement. Excuse me. And they captured several pieces of Yankee artillery. So that day, one of his first actions as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia was to recommend James Lawson Kemper for promotion to brigadier general. Now, the armies, any of you that's ever been in the Army knows things go kind of slow in the Army. You know, a lot of paperwork and a lot of hurry up and wait, and the Confederate Army wasn't any different. But the president signed off on it, and the Congress voted on it the same day. I don't know whether there was ever another promotion in the Confederate Army happened so fast. It amounted to a promotion on the field of valor. And so now Kemper became a brigadier general. He was given command of 5 infantry regiments, 1st, 3rd, 7th, 11th, and 17th Virginia. Later on, they'd have the 24th Virginia added to it. And these men were so proud to be part of Kemper's regiment that even after the war, they still called themselves Kemper's men. And they had a big part in campaigning for him when he ran for governor. Of course, they missed the Battle of Chancellorsville. They were in North Carolina, repelling the Yankee invasion in North Carolina. But he got back in time to serve as a pallbearer for General Stonewall Jackson after he had died from wounds he received there at Chancellorsville. And then he was with the Army when it invaded the North. He'd been up there once before, the previous summer, at the Battle of Sharpsburg, and had really performed well in the Battle of Sharpsburg. As a matter of fact, his regiment showed up on the field at just the right time to stop the Yankee advance there at what became known as Burnside's Bridge. They took the heights and repelled that Yankee advance, and that saved the day long enough for General Lee to get his army out of Maryland back to Virginia safely. But this time was different. This time they were invading the North and taking the war not just to Maryland, the border state, but all the way into Pennsylvania. Kemper's brigade was part of Longstreet's corps, and they were the rear guard of the Army in that invasion. In other words, the Battle of Gettysburg had been going on for about 2 days when they got there. They were the freshest troops to arrive on the field. So General Lee had plans for them that next morning. Longstreet's corps, Pickett's division of Virginians, including Kemper's brigade, would be the lead-off men in a grand assault across 1 mile of open fields against dug in, entrenched Yankees, backed up with artillery. It went down in history known as Pickett's Charge. Kemper rode into battle. Contrary to orders, General Lee had instructed that no officer was to ride into battle. They'd be a sitting duck for Yankee sharpshooters. General Garnett, one of the other brigadier generals in Pickett's division, had been accused over a year earlier of cowardice by Stonewall Jackson. And a court-martial was convened here in Orange County, right up at Liberty Mills. And then the Yankees invaded down through Culpeper, and it led to the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and the court-martial never took place. And so Garnett was never exonerated. Of course, Jackson had died, and Garnett felt like he had this mark against him, having been accused and never been exonerated. And so he decided to ride into battle. Well, Kemper and Garnett were good friends. He didn't want to see Brigadier General Garnett riding into battle by himself, so he decided to ride into battle. The third and wiser of the three brigadier generals, Lewis Armstead, walked like he was told. Garnett was shot off of his horse and killed. Armstead was eventually shot and killed. Kemper got within about 100 feet of the Yankee lines, and a Vermont sergeant, his name escapes me, shot him. A .58 caliber Springfield mini ball entered his leg, ranged up through the groin, and lodged against his back, against his spine. .58 caliber, that's almost big as my thumb, over ½ inch in diameter. Can you imagine a piece of hot lead cutting a furrow through your body? I just had knee surgery, and that's bad enough, but this thing going up through his spine. He was blown out of the saddle, of course. His men, the Yankees, charged over and captured him. His men charged and took him back. He was brought off the field on a blanket. Most of you may have saw the movie Gettysburg. You remember that? In the movie Gettysburg, there's a scene where Kemper's being carried off the field, and General Lee walks up to him and says, "General, I hope you're not seriously hurt." And Kemper says, "Well, they tell me it's mortal." And Lee says, "I fear not." And he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Kemper said, "Yeah. Remember my men for what they did today." Everybody thought he was going to die. And so when the army pulled out, he was injured too seriously to carry. He wouldn't have survived a wagon ride back to Virginia in those days. So they left him in a farmhouse with a few attendants. And General Lee even wrote a letter to his wife expressing his condolences. He was a tougher old bird than anybody gave him credit for, because he lay in that house for about 7 days. The Yankees figured he was going to die, and so they didn't even give him medical attention. After about 7 days, he was still hanging on. So finally, they sent a doctor around. And after a few weeks in the hospital there at Gettysburg, he was getting around good enough that they shipped him off to Fort McHenry, Baltimore, to a prison camp. And there was a one-on-one prisoner exchange worked out. The Confederate government valued Kemper so that instead of waiting till a big prisoner exchange where dozens of men would be traded, they worked out a one-on-one deal. Brigadier General Charles Graham from Michigan was traded one-on-one for Kemper. Graham hadn't been hurt, so he could return right to the field of battle, and the Yankees got the best end of the deal, they thought. They figured Kemper, he'd never be no good again. He came home back to Virginia. He didn't come back to Madison. He went to Richmond and offered his services. Of course, he walked with crutches. He was paralyzed in the lower extremities. The Army didn't have much for a paralyzed brigadier general to do. So he went on recruiting duty. And he went from town to town making speeches. And he was making a speech there in Madison on the courthouse steps. And some old mountaineer from up in the mountains was hearing him. And Kemper was talking about all the fame and glory of being in the service and fighting for your state. Of course, he's doing this while he's standing there on crutches in pain. And the old mountaineer said, "It ain't much of a recommend for me, General." But it wasn't long before he was promoted from brigadier general to major general. By September of that year, he was now a major general in the Confederate Army. And his duties increased. He was given command of the reserve forces of Virginia and given command of the conscription bureau of the Confederate Army. He was in such pain, and so he couldn't ride a horse into battle, so he was no good as a field commander, but he set about to do his best in these new jobs. He made his headquarters in Lynchburg. He didn't want to be in Richmond, where the seat of government was, because he was in too much pain, and he'd be tempted to try to join the army out in the field. So he got as far away from the fighting as he could and made his headquarters in Lynchburg. Most accounts will say that he did the most valuable duty to the Confederate Army in these two jobs. In that last year and a half or so of the war, he probably added somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 men to the Confederate Army through the reserves being called up and through the conscription acts. When Richmond fell in April of '65, and the seat of government was moved to Danville, Danville being closer to Lynchburg than Richmond, I guess Kemper figured he ought to be with the president and the other government officials, and he went to Danville. And they evacuated Danville, and President Davis and the rest of the Confederate cabinet and officials rode off. Kemper couldn't ride with them. He still hadn't gotten to where he could ride a horse. He needed crutches to get around, and with his paralyzed legs, there's no way he could get up on a horse's back. So he fell into Yankee hands for the second time in his career. He was paroled and allowed to return to his family. Bell and the children had spent the war down in Brunswick County. That's where his sister and her husband were from. So he joined them and then demanded that they come back to Madison with him and start life over anew, whatever that was going to be. Remember, he was a lawyer and a politician and a soldier. And those three things were outlawed after the war ended. So he trying to make a living and take care of the children and was hard, especially for a crippled man who couldn't walk, barely walk on crutches and couldn't ride a horse. Got back to Madison, and that home, that log house he bought and added a brick wing on, was burnt to the ground. George Armstrong Custer had burned it. Didn't even have a home to go to. Not only that, his 2-year-old son, who he had never yet met, died from a childhood disease. His mother-in-law stepped in and bought him a house there on Main Street. Today it's called the Kemper Mansion. It's the head of the Madison. It's where the Madison Historical Society is headquartered. He moved his family into it. He was in so much pain and had such trouble sleeping. He went to sleeping outside in the little log kitchen, and he set that up as his law office. And he tried to practice law. He received the parole in Danville, and he was given a pardon. He applied, and President Johnson signed his pardon. It took a while before they let former Confederates practice law. So in the meantime, he did the best he could. He had a little farm over near Hebron Church, and he farmed. Of course, the people that had worked for him before the war were now set free, but they all chose to stay with him and work with him, and he kept those families on as employees and built them homes and sent their kids to school. Most of them stayed with him all of their lives. After Reconstruction, when Virginia rejoined the Union in 1870 and held their first governor's election after Reconstruction, he was talked into running for governor. I say talked into running because he didn't campaign for it. He didn't seek the office. As a matter of fact, Kemper came from a school of thought that high political office should neither be sought nor declined. And so he had nothing to do with it. When this new political party that was founded, the Conservative Party of Virginia, held their convention and nominated him on the first ballot to be their candidate, they had to hunt him down to tell him he was now the candidate for governor. The railroads, which were back in the hands of Southerners, all gave him free passes to ride their trains to go to political rallies, but he didn't care for that kind of thing. That's where his old regiment came in. The Kemper Campaign Club, the Kemper's men, the people that had served with him during the war, they held stump speeches, met in courthouses and town halls, and traveled the state campaigning for their former commander. The night he won the election, he went to bed at his usual time, and they had to wake him up and tell him he was now governor. And when he went to Richmond and took the office, he didn't have a paid staff. He said that was a Yankee innovation that he didn't believe in. He had a teenage son, and that was his personal secretary, and his wife had passed away. He was a widower, so he had no one to serve as hostess, and so there were no formal events. And he set about going to work, and he worked. He was one of the finest governors Virginia ever had. One of the first things he got passed through, of course, I spoke about earlier, was the public education system. He appointed his old friend, John D. Imboden, who had been a Confederate general, to be Virginia's ambassador to the North to attract industry down here. He wanted to develop Virginia's natural resources. And so the coal mines, the railroads, the timber industry needed Yankee money in order to function. And Imboden was given that job. His other friend from college days, John Eccles, became president of the C&O Railroad. And so most of the coal and timber was hauled over that railroad at a discount rate to get Virginia back on track. And then something happened. The city of Petersburg held its first election after Reconstruction. And the city fathers decided to take away the vote from formerly enslaved people. So only whites could vote in the election. Petersburg was majority black then, as it is today. When Kemper heard about this, he declared the election null and void because the majority of the people hadn't been given the opportunity to vote. Almost immediately, all across the South, Kemper was hung in effigy. And then the newspapers got wind of it. And former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, spoke out that Kemper had done the right thing. That's what the South stood for, was rule by native Southerners. And if the native Southerners happen to be of black folks, then that they got to choose who represented them in their city councils. And before you know it, he went from being the most vilified man in the South to being the most admired man, not just in this country, but in the whole world. The London Times had his picture on the front page. Paris newspapers carried his picture and stories about him. His old enemy from the war, Ulysses S. Grant, who was now president, called him to the White House and offered him the vice presidency. And Kemper turned him down. He said, no, I was elected to be the governor of Virginia. I still got a job to do. When his term ended, he had one thing to say. He said, this old soldier deserves an honorable discharge. So he moved from Madison to the place here in Orange, Walnut Hills. He bought that 600-acre farm, built the house, and moved. He bought that place intentionally because he liked the location. If you've ever been there, it's exactly a mile from the closest paved road. And he didn't do nothing to improve the driveway. He didn't want people wearing him to death. And maybe that was one reason he was forgotten in his old age, is because he became somewhat of a recluse. He would come to Orange now and then, try a case once in a while for some of his old clients. Once in a while, he'd go to Madison. There's stories about him staying at the hotel there on Main Street in Madison and always coming up with a reason why he couldn't pay his board that night. But for the most part, he preferred to stay there and manage his little farm and live the rest of his life. Didn't mean he gave up on things. He was probably the first man in Orange County ever had a hot tub. If you've ever been to Walnut Hills, you'll see that little octagon structure behind the house. He'd have his workers fill it full of water, build a fire under it, and he'd go soak in it for hours at a time because that was the only way he could get rid of the pain in his legs from the wounds. It was there in Walnut Hills. He passed away quietly and peacefully, just the way he would have wanted it in 1895. 130 years ago this year, this coming August. He was buried in a little family cemetery. He'd already had a couple children had passed away, so the little cemetery was there. He was buried out there. His daughter, she tried to run the place as a bed and breakfast. This was before bed and breakfast became popular and didn't make much of a go of it. And so finally she ended up selling it to the DeJarnets. He was a clerk of court here in Orange County, I believe, and he raised his family there. And of course the Jeans bought it, and then it's changed hands again more recently. But and sometime in the 30s, the United Confederate Veterans held their national reunion here in Orange. And they figured it was time he have a tombstone. So they went out there from here in Orange. They traveled out to Walnut Hills and had a ceremony and erected a tombstone. And the Sons of Confederate Veterans Camp, Kemper Fry Strawley Camp, has held a ceremony there on June 11th, his birth date, every year since about 1988 or 89 now. So well over 30 some years. I don't know how many times I've spoke there, but we've had some good speakers. One of them sitting there in the second row, Frank Walker's been there and spoke before. Any questions or comments? I was told to wrap it up in 45 minutes. I went 2 minutes over. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
When you ran for governor, who did you run against?
He ran against two people. Both of them were Yankees. One of them was an outright carpetbagger. He'd come down from up north and ran as a Democrat. The other one was a Republican. And Kemper's party was called the Conservative Party of Virginia. He carried the day. As a matter of fact, he had the biggest majority in a gubernatorial election, held a record for many years. George Allen beat Mary Sue Terry by about the equal margin. But that's how long that record stood. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Where was the log cabin that Custer burned?
It was right there on Main Street in Madison, in front of Beth Carr Baptist Church.
What was the engagement? What was Custer doing?
Custer that was February 28th through March 1st, 1864. He made a raid on Charlottesville. And he spent the night in Madison causing havoc and burning homes and businesses. And one of them was Kemper's house. Of course, he invaded Greene and Albemarle County, and what was called the skirmish or Battle of Rowell Hill resulted there, where they built a shopping center on top of the battlefield. And then he retreated back through Greene, and the Battle of Standardsville was fought that next day on the way back. And then that was the last time Custer decided to come this far south. But that's when it was burned. Custer burned 20 churches in Madison County during that raid, every mill in the county, and the homes of all known Confederate officers. He didn't get the courthouse, though. He left the courthouse because it had been designed by Thomas Jefferson, and he had a personal admiration of Thomas Jefferson. He would have burnt the records, but the clerk of the court had enough sense to get them out of there and tuck them up on Blakey Ridge and hid them in a cave until the Yankees were out of the county. Any other questions? Yes.
Did the bullet remain?
The bullet was never removed. Yeah, it remained in his body. It was too dangerous to try to remove. It lodged against his spine, and it would have been almost sudden death if they'd have tried to remove it. And just a fraction of an inch, one way or the other, would have severed his spine.
Any truth to the notion that he was addicted to laudanum?
Kemper went through a period of time when he was a heavy drinker. He bought whiskey by the barrel. He didn't drink during the day when he was working, because he had to have a clear mind to run a farm or argue a case in court when they came up. But at night, the only way to kill that pain and get a good night's sleep was have a few strong drinks. There's no record of him ever being addicted to anything else. And by the time he died, he'd pretty well quit drinking. As a matter of fact, his records were very detailed. And every year when he sold the crops, and he'd usually take the crops up north somewhere and sell them, he would buy whiskey and have it shipped back. And for the last couple of years, he didn't have any whiskey shipped back. So, and there's no record. So I think he when he was a young man, he'd been a member of the Sons of Temperance Society. He was opposed to strong drink, but nothing else worked on the pain. And then I don't know whether the pain went away or whether he just gave up on it, or maybe whiskey went up and it got too expensive for him. I don't know. But no rumors about him using drugs there's no foundation. No. Yes.
You mentioned that families continued to work for him after the war.
Yes.
Stayed with him
Mm-hmm.
for the rest of his life. Is there some information about some of those families?
Oh, in his personal papers, a lot of the families, he never owned a lot of slaves. 6 or 7 families were the most before the war. They stayed with him, ran the place. They didn't run off when Custer and the other Yankees came through. They stayed there and farmed. When the war ended and they were freed, they chose to stay on and work for him. When he bought Walnut Hills and sold his property in Madison, they came to Walnut Hills with him. And he built them a little settlement there, built that church for them, built a school to educate their children. And several generations worked for him on the farm. And, they worked for him. They were good workers, and he treated them right.
Do you recall, you mentioned several places where his papers are, and we've done some research on that little Petersburg community. Do you recall offhand which of the repositories his paperwork for?
That would be at UVA.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
This hasn't got anything to do with Kemper, but in early 1960s, I bought 4-H calf from Mr. Jeans.
Uh-huh.
He became a reserve grand champion.
Oh, he raised some fine cattle, fine cattle. Yep. Ike Jeans was a fine man. I went over one Sunday afternoon. I was the commander of the Kemper Fry Strother camp, and the marker out on 15, not the one that's there now, but the one that used to be there, told about his grave, and I had never been to it. So it's one Sunday afternoon, pouring down rain. I rode out there. I had no idea it was that far back in there, you know. I went up, knocked on the door, and Mr. Jeans opened the door, and I introduced myself. And I told him I would like to see General Kemper's grave. He said, "Well, you help yourself." He said, "I'm not going over in this pouring rain, but it's right over on the hillside." And he and I became fast friends. And when I asked him if the Sons of Confederate Veterans could hold a ceremony there, he jumped at the chance. And no more hospitable man could you ever meet. Him and his family, just wonderful folks, and raised some fine cattle. Yes, sir.
Harold, what about the insurance claim on his son?
All right. I knew you was going to ask that, Frank. That's why I waited. He sent his son, James Lawson Kemper Jr., to Philadelphia. That was the leading grain market with the year's harvest of grain, to oversee the sale of it. And his son never came home. The grain was sold. Now, I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it was considerable for that day and age. Around $6,000, I think, worth of grain was sold. But the boy never came home. Kemper couldn't find him. The boy, of course, they didn't have cell phones and email and all the stuff you got nowadays. So it was more of a job to try to find somebody. And he hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to find his son for him. They tracked him to a poker game, and where he lost heavily. And he got out of Philadelphia by the skin of his teeth. And the next time they picked him up, he was in Chicago. And he lost in a poker game out there, lost money he didn't have. And they concluded he either committed suicide or was killed before his gambling debts, because there was no trace of him afterwards. They reported this back to Kemper. He had done built Walnut Hills. He was in great debt there, you know. And he had a life insurance policy on his son. And so with the Pinkerton Detective Agency's report that the boy either committed suicide or had been murdered, he went to the Lloyds of London, who carried the policy, and showed them the paperwork, and they paid off on it. And he paid off his debts. Walnut Hills was free and clear. That night, in a pouring rainstorm, who knocked on the door but James Lawson Kemper Jr. Alive and well, drunk as a skunk, but alive and well. And his father, I can only imagine. Number one, here's your son who you felt was long dead, but here was the boy that you just cashed in his life insurance policy to pay off your farm. The boy was let in, given some dry clothes and a warm meal, and by morning he was gone again, never to be heard from again. Kemper contacted Lloyds of London that very next day, and he told them the whole story, that the boy wasn't dead. At least he wasn't dead last night when he showed up at the house drunk. And he also told them that he couldn't afford to pay the insurance policy back. So he had to take out a mortgage on the house to pay the insurance company. He was in debt right up to the day he died, but he paid them back. Yeah. The boy did surface after his daddy died in Cuba, riding with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders under an assumed name. But yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the new historical marker on 15.
Yeah.
Which claims that he was a large slaveholder.
Yeah, I don't know who wrote it, but they made a typographical error, I believe.
I complain to them
You,
without any
Mm.
response.
yeah. No, his father, near as I can tell, his father owned about 16 families or so. He owned 6 or 7 at the peak of his career. And I don't know where that qualified as a large slaveholder, but that sign's very misleading. It's a good thing they turned it sideways because not many people will see it and fall for that. Yeah. Yankees are always hard at work trying to mess things up. Any other questions?
Harold, I got a question.
Yes, sir.
When Longstreet's Corps got sent down to the East Tennessee campaign, did Kemper make that trip? Or was he
No, he didn't make that trip. That was in September and October of '63 after Gettysburg. Kemper he didn't get home until late September. They'd already gone down to Tennessee. And in October, he was in Richmond trying to figure out what he was going to do next because he couldn't walk, couldn't ride a horse. The president didn't want to lose him, so that he went on that campaign trail recruiting that winter and that fall and winter. And the next spring, then he was given command of the reserve forces of Virginia, and then later the conscription bureau. But he missed out on that campaign.
Now, when he was commander of the Virginia Reserve Forces, did that also include the Home Guard?
Well,
Was that a different?
that was a different.
organizational structure?
That was a different organizational structure. Virginia had a very detailed and convoluted military establishment. You had the militia, you had your volunteer regiments, like the 7th Virginia was a Virginia unit, but it was a volunteer regiment that was added to the Confederate Army. The militia was a different structure. And then you had the reserves. When conscription came about, they had ages, eventually it was 16 and 45, I think. Anybody younger or older fell into the reserves and eventually the reserves were called up. And then when the reserves got called up, they had the Home Guard, which was even older or younger men that stayed at home. And
Including my maternal great-grandfather.
there you go. Yep.
My maternal great-grandfather, I forget how old he was, but when they finally reeled him in, I think it was Kemper, at least out of kindness, noted to whoever was going to be in charge of him that at his age and his corpulence, the guy who rode the horse tried to walk.
Yeah. Kemper, I don't know whether any of you have seen my book, but I've got at that time in the early 90s, what was known as the only pictures I could find of him. And the first picture that's in there shows him in a colonel's uniform. He's got a big bushy beard, long hair, and he's wearing the 3 stars on his collar of a Confederate colonel. The next picture shows him after Gettysburg, and he ain't no skin and bones. He's balder than I am. That long hair must have fallen out while he was in prison. His beard was white, and of course he was in a Confederate general's uniform. He lost an enormous amount of weight. He was always a heavy fellow, but what made me think of it, Frank was talking about corpulence. Mm-hmm. The last letter Kemper ever wrote, he wrote to one of his pen pals, and he was talking about his girth, how it had increased. He had gone from a size 38 pants to a size 54 pants. And he said that he suffered from dropsical swelling. Anybody in here a physician? It took me a long time to find a physician that knew what dropsical swelling was. Congestive heart failure. Yeah. All that fluid gone to his lower extremities. Yeah. Any other questions? Dropsy. Yep. Dropsical swelling. Yeah.
This has been so good. I
Thank
think We should sing Dixie.
I'm a, you lead off. I'll join right in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Powerful program. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're certainly
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
All right. That concludes our program